Men tend to grieve through action. They tend to emote through action. They'll do things, or they'll emote and grieve through inaction, where they don't do anything. It's all in here. Both are very powerful and fine ways to heal. They're just not known. And in today's world, what we see is people are telling men they need to do things more like women. Men are pushed towards action, getting things done. And they also use that action and getting things done in order to process their emotions. We need both men and women. We've got to love both men and women for who they are. Mm-hmm. Right now we're in a shaming world where men are shamed for being themselves. It's crazy.
Welcome to Perspectives on Men. I'm the host, Warren Sinkowski. My guest today is Tom Golden. Tom Golden is a therapist and speaker who has given workshops on the masculine side of healing in the US, Australia, Canada, and Europe. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and on CNN, CBS Evening News, ESPN, the NFL Channel, and others. Tom served as vice chairman of the Maryland Commission for Men's Health and is the author of several books, including Swallowed by a Snake, The Way Men Heal, and Helping Mothers Be Closer to Their Sons. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Warren. It's good to be here.
Yes. I'm excited to have a conversation with you today about your work and your writing and a number of different topics. So if you're okay, we'll get right into it.
Good.
So I read your book recently, The Way Men Heal. And in the beginning of that, you go through a little bit of your personal history, training as a social worker many years ago. And you had a phrase in your book that said at the time, during your class, there were 17 female counselors and only one male, which was you.
Yes.
Actually, that was, not during your training, but during your first job after grad school.
Right.
So can you tell me what it was like being the only male in that work environment?
I liked it, first off, because I didn't have a job until then, and it was hard to get a job, and so I was happy being there. I really loved the women who worked there, but it turns out that what they really wanted to do was to make sure all the men who came in went to me, so they wouldn't have to work with the men, because they all thought, men don't grieve, men are this, men are that, and by the way, it was a counseling center for death and dying, and so they had very strong ideas about men and the way they did things. And so I got a whole caseload of mostly men,
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm wondering why the counseling profession would think that it's better to send a male patient to a male counselor.
Because they didn't want to work with the men. They didn't want to do it. It was harder, it was much harder. The women I had, it was like simple. They did what I was taught to do in grad school. You talk about your feelings, you talk about what's going on with yourself and your family and blah, 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 blah. I tried to do that with women. It was wonderful. It would just work and things would flow and the crisis stuff would come up and everything was good. But with men, it didn't work so well. It didn't work so well at all. And so I started realizing, wait a minute, either I'm really screwing up here or maybe there's something I need to learn about working with men. And that's what took me on the path that I went down, was trying to figure out what really is going on with men.
Right. So, as you say, that started you on the path of learning how men's way of healing is different from a typical woman's way of healing.
Yes.
So, maybe we can talk about your books then, because I think you really speak a lot about that during your writing, especially the book, The Way Men Heal. In that book, you describe that the emoting and the verbal communication that women often express after trauma or after loss sometimes doesn't work so well for men, and that there are other ways that you found that are more effective and more useful for men when they're grieving. So can you tell us maybe a little bit about those ways?
Yeah, when I was working at the center, I realized that what I was doing wasn't really helpful. And so I started studying different things about men. There was very little written on men at the time. But one of the things that was written was the cross-cultural grief material, the anthropological studies. And the more I read, the more I got excited because they showed over and over and over again that in these indigenous peoples, They would give women a place to emote, a place to talk, a place to connect, but they'd give men something to do. And it just opened my eyes, and I thought, holy crap, this is what I've been missing. Is that men tend to grieve through action. They tend to emote through action. They'll do things, or they'll emote and grieve through inaction, where they don't do anything. It's all in here. Both are very powerful and fine ways to heal. They're just not known. And in today's world, what we see is people are telling men they need to do things more like women. Why isn't he crying? Why isn't he talking about his feelings? Oh my, And so I started realizing slowly, this was over a period of probably 10 or 15 years, I started realizing slowly that men's safe places were not in conversation about their emotions usually. Now, men can talk about their stuff easily if they feel a certain safety, but our culture does not give men that safe space usually. Whereas we give women that safe space easily, Indeed. Right. So I started realizing that, I started changing the way I worked with men. Rather than just talking about emotions and things, I'd talk about what they're doing, what's happening. And what I found was over and over and over again, the men were doing something in honor of the laws. In honor of the laws. And it blew me away. This one guy was a mathematician, and his brother died, and he went to his family home, and he cut down a limb from the tree that was in the backyard that they both climbed up on as kids, and he carved a baseball bat out of that limb. Mm-hmm. And he then inscribed it with what he wanted to tell his brother, etc. And he took that bat, and he went around to all his friends and his brother's friends, and everybody signed it. And you see, that activity, that action for him was a way to honor his brother and also connect with the story about what had happened, not just with himself, but with other people, with the other men. Because when they're signing the bat, they say, I remember Joe, he did such and such, and you'd be talking about the emotions and about the missing him in the same way as someone else might do in a support group, but you were doing it around an activity. And that just opened my eyes right there, because what I found was, if I ask men, what are you doing with this? They'll just open right up. They'll tell you all about what they're doing with it. But if you ask men, what are you feeling? You're going to get silence for a while, usually. We know now that testosterone basically numbs out a man's emotions. He doesn't feel emotions in the same way. When I was doing therapy with couples, I'd ask the woman, what are you feeling about such and such? And she'd go on and on. And I turned to the man, and how about you? And it was partly because testosterone scrambles emotions for men. Until later, 2 hours later, he'd be able to tell me about that stuff. But in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of a quick question, he's not going to be able to respond in the same way she can, because testosterone is scrambling that stuff. There's good reasons for it. Imagine a policeman going to a crime, going to a car accident, a big car accident, right? A mess, his body's whatever. Now, does he emote at the time? Does he break down and cry and say, oh, this is horrible? No, he gets the job done first, and then he emotes. But his primary goal is to get that job done, get her done. And so men are pushed towards action, getting things done, and they also use that action and getting things done in order to process their emotions. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense, yeah. And you mentioned this in your book. You describe it in slightly different words, but I really like the stories that you just told me now and the examples that you gave.
There's hundreds of them. Hundreds.
Yeah. Women, you say, and it's not just you saying it, but there's research on this too, that when they are stressed or they face trauma or loss, they it's called tend and befriend, or
yes.
they revert to interpersonal interactions and verbal
Correct.
Communications.
Yes, Shelley Taylor, 2002. That was fascinating research. She also found biological differences, which few people know about, but she found that the oxytocin, people get a burst of oxytocin when they're stressed. And both men and women get this burst of oxytocin, But the women move that towards an affiliative kind of connection where they connect with other women. The men don't do that. She was scratching her head. She found out later that the reason is testosterone negates the oxytocin. It negates the affiliative action of oxytocin. Whereas the women, the estrogen amplifies it, makes it more. So we've got biological stuff going on inside us that makes us different as men and women. And it's so important to know about.
We do, and not only that, but men and women are not living in two completely different worlds because, as you pointed out, some women, the way their brains work is it resembles a little bit more the typical male brain.
Yes.
And some men's brains resemble a little bit more the typical female brain.
Yes.
So there is an overlap. There's a place where we interact and we come together.
We're wonderfully different, but if you have to look at it in terms of like height. If you look at height, men are taller than women, right? But there's some women who are very tall and some men who are very short. And so you can't say all men are like this and all women are like that. But you can say, in general, men are taller, women are probably not as tall. And that's the same thing with the grieving stuff. There are a lot of men out there who are moved to emote and to talk about it, etc. And that's fine and wonderful. And there's some women out there who are going to move towards action. So really we have to be on our toes as therapists and get to know the person we're working with and find out what their way to process things is, rather than make an assumption, oh, that's a guy, he's going to do it like this. Nah, it doesn't work. And of course, this all spins from the testosterone flood at 2 months in utero, which, the boys get this flood of testosterone at 2 months. And that has all kinds of changes that the boy's brain goes through. Some of the girls get a similar flood. And they're finding that those girls who get a similar flood become what they call tomboys, because they got this testosterone flood. There's all kinds of fascinating things that it does that we probably don't have time to get into right now. The important part is that we're biologically different. And yes, you're so right. It's a gray mess. This is not a black and white. Not all women, all men. But boy, we are different in lots and lots of ways, both psychologically, socially, and biologically.
Yes, that's true. I think there's a lot of evidence to that point.
Yes.
The healing actions I wanted to talk about from that book, the same book, you divide them into practical, creative, or inactive. So the inactive is more like processing alone, like a man just kind of sitting with his thoughts and feelings and grinding on them. But the practical actions, you've mentioned some, making a baseball bat or building and repairing things. Like I could imagine a guy in his garage working on a car, working on a motorcycle, doing woodworking, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yes. For me, I'm more of a creative type, so making music, doing creative writing, art, that kind of thing. Yes. These are examples of how men can heal too.
Yes, exactly. And what you find is the men connect their grief or their upset, their feelings, with the action. There's a story about Beethoven. I think, was that in that little book?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and Beethoven, with his friend who was wiped out from her children's death, he wouldn't go and see her for a while. He couldn't, until finally he invited her over to his place. What did he do? He played for her for an hour. And she left without saying anything, but was later interviewed and said, that this was the most compassion she'd ever gotten. It's fascinating. It was through his music, through what he did well. A lot of times, men's actions will either be through the way they play or through what they do very, very well. So you can kind of keep an eye on that, guys. Look at the way you play, the way you do well, and you're probably looking at the way you tend to connect with your emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you said also that it's not just any action, but it has to be an action that connects you to your loss and grief and your feelings.
Yes.
So that it's kind of a way of accessing the feelings, but indirectly, instead of someone just straight up saying, how do you feel?
Yes.
You watch what he's doing and you see how that connects to his experience.
There are both men and women out there who, quote, don't deal with their feelings. They stuff everything down, they get rid of it, etc. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the guy who is compulsive and obsessive about it either. We're talking about a behavior that comes to him many times through an insight or through an intuition that he does something that helps him connect in with that loss. He may not even know it's connecting him in with the loss, but when you ask him about it, he'll tell you. He'll say, yeah, that's connected.
So, can I ask you then, when a man has gone through the process of healing, or he's making progress, what does that look like? What signs would his friends or family notice in him?
Well, probably pretty much the same signs you'd notice in women. And that is when people have come close to finishing the unfinished business, what happens is they move slowly more and more into the present moment, into the present tense. And that's one of the best indicators for whether you've healed up or not. Are you able to enjoy the moment in the here and now? If you can, then you're probably pretty much working on things and it's coming along, you know?
Right.
I remember after my father died, I had this experience with my son where we started listening to music. I said, oh, let's turn it up. So we turned it up. It was blues. We turned it up real loud, and he was a little guy at the time. And we were dancing, having fun. And I realized then, I'm better. I'm better now. It was a marker for me. It sort of showed me, that I can enjoy the present tense now in a different kind of way, in a way that is joyful.
Yeah, that reminds me of what I've read about psychology is that, people who are still affected by the past, they can't move on from it. It's like it still has their claws in them.
Yeah.
But when you've processed an experience in a healthy way, you've digested it and you've interpreted it, then it's still part of your history. It just doesn't have the same effect on you now.
You've digested it and you pooped it out. You let the waste go. You know that feeling after you have a big poop? It's like it's a good feeling, right? Same kind of thing. You feel like you've let it go.
Yeah.
Now I can be relaxed. Now I can be involved in the moment. Play my music. Play drums. Do what I want.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me just zoom out a little bit, because I think this is a very good example of how therapists or counselors or social workers could work with men. Talking about those professions, these kind of caring professions or therapeutic professions, they do seem to be, it's mostly women working in them, from what I'm aware, in North America.
Yes.
And not only that, but the modalities and the theories and ideas behind them seem to come from a female point of origin.
Yes.
And a lot of them, as you say, they don't work on men, and they're not really suited to men's needs. So if you were to advise, for example, the APA or another professional body on how to change their training and how to change the advice that they're giving to practitioners, what would you say to those bodies? What would you say to the schools?
Well, I tried telling the APA a couple of things, and they threw me out. So that tells you something right there. But the first thing is, can you learn to love someone for the way they are, rather than want to change them and make them more like you or more like you think they should be? I mean, that's the bottom line, is can a therapist love the person they're working with to such a degree that they really want to know them? They want to find out how they do things. What do you do? How do you get around things? What makes you tick,
Right.
And that's the first thing. The second thing is, damn well read some on men. There's a lot of stuff out there today. There was nothing in the 1980s on men, but there's a lot out there now. Read that little 50-page book, The Way Men Heal, and you'll get a good sense of what in fact, there's a little part in the back on therapists, ideas for therapists. Now, how do you work with men? Because, the men and women who are therapists these days have been taught a feminine mode. They've been taught a female way to work with things. And they expect their men clients to do it like that. And man, you got to change that quick. It's not going to work. He's going to run.
Right.
Or he's going to shut down.
Right, exactly. Yeah, a lot of men don't go into therapy at all. Like, they just deal with their challenges on their own.
And why don't they go into therapy? Why don't they?
That's the question.
Yeah, and there's 4 good reasons for it. Men are doing what comes naturally to them. The first reason is precarious manhood, where the research is clear. It's been going on for 15 years now, The research shows that every culture they have studied, and they've gone all around the world, men have to prove they are men. Women do not have to prove they're women. A woman's role is ascribed. In other words, she gets it automatically. When she has her first period, she becomes a woman. But men don't have that luxury. Men have to prove they are men. And in order to do that, guess what? That has to be in public. You have to publicly prove you're a man. Very different from the scenario with women and how, women are automatically considered women. In fact, I don't think women really understand men in that respect. They have no idea that men live through a scenario where they have to prove themselves all the time. This creates a very different kind of person. And if you have to prove yourself all the time, the other thing is, what are they trying to prove? They're trying to prove that they are independent and they are of high status, right? Well, what does therapy say? Therapy says, I can't do it myself. I need someone else. Dependent role. You are dependent. And so men are going to avoid therapy because it makes them appear dependent. Just like asking for directions, what does that do? It makes men look dependent. He has to depend on someone else to figure out how to get there. And if it shows in public, his esteem, his manhood drops like a rock. Because the Vandello is it Vandello that did research? I think it's Vandello. I forget. But the guy that did the research said manhood is hard to attain and easy to lose. So that's what guys are dealing with all the time. And so that's one of the 4 reasons why men don't want to go into therapy, because it makes them look dependent.
Yes, and when men admit their vulnerability or their weakness or their dependence, it lowers their reputation, their status.
Yes.
Whereas the same is not true of women, generally speaking,
Correct.
on average. Yeah.
Yes. And the second one is testosterone. Testosterone in men pushes them to strive for status. It used to be Alan Alda, with the whole testosterone poisoning crap. And all the researchers tried to prove that testosterone was about aggression and violence. They're all wrong. They now know that testosterone is about striving for status. That's what men want to do. They want to increase their status. Their minds were blown when they did this research on fairness in bargaining. And they gave some people testosterone thinking they were going to be the ones that would, cheat or do whatever. They found out that when they gave them testosterone, they were more fair than the others. That's because men strive for status. Status is key, for all kinds of things. And status, if going to therapy in your group increases your status, men are going to go. They'll go. But if going to therapy in your group says, something wrong with you, you're dependent, they're not going to go. So that's the second reason is testosterone. And testosterone does so much. We talked about it's tending to muzzle emotions, but it does so much more than that. It increases his capacity to take risks, decreases his fear. So men live in a different world from women. They just live in a different world, and most women have no clue. They think men are supposed to be like them. No, ladies, no.
And
He's
those are the messages.
Like
we hear that message from major organizations, international and national, public sector, private sector organizations, that men, if they could only be more like women, the world would be such a better place.
How many times have I heard that silliness? It's just crazy. We need both men and women. We've got to love both men and women for who they are. Mm-hmm. Right now we're in a shaming world where men are shamed for being themselves. It's crazy. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, and masculinity itself is under attack. Right.
And it has been for about 40 years. Mm-hmm. It's crazy.
Yeah, we need to turn that around.
We do need to turn that around. And a part of turning it around is helping people understand how men are really different from women. And wonderfully different. I mean, women are wonderfully different too. We're all different. And so we need to understand that and start accepting people for who they are, not for who we want them to be.
Yeah.
And the other two is the dominance hierarchy is another reason, because men live in hierarchies. All the time, men are in a hierarchy. I wish we had time to go into how that works, but it's just fascinating. The boys choose sides when they're growing up, right? With the two best boys choose sides, the best boy next, the best boy next, best boy next, and down to the end. And everyone hopes, oh, don't choose me last. Please not last. That's the hierarchy. And by choosing, the boys are getting a sense of where they are in that hierarchy. It's a very good lesson for them, because it's going to happen later in life when they're at work. There's going to be a hierarchy there too. So learning how to deal with that hierarchy. But men have hierarchies every place. And think about it, the sleeves of the military says where you are in the hierarchy. The sports stats, all about hierarchy, who's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, etc.
And the music world too, you have first violin, second violin.
There you go.
Anywhere where there's an organization, you're probably going to find a hierarchy.
Yes. And then the last one is moral typecasting, which is a fairly new look at things. And they've known for years that people tend to see moral situations in terms of dyads, where there's one has what they call agency and the other has patiency. One is the agency is the person who does something to someone else, either good or evil, and patiency is someone who has something done to them. And they found over time that the people who have agency are seen as being strong and able, and they can do this and whatever. And if they ever do anything wrong, there's trouble, because they are also assumed to be in need of more punishment. People who have patiency are seen as people who are in need, are possible victims, are in need of assistance, etc. And this has been going on for years, but then Tanya Reynolds came along and she found that, guess what? We tend to see men as having agency and women as having patiency. And that is, of course, the root of the empathy gap, where we've known for years that men get much less compassion than women, period. It's just a fact. And now we know part of the reason why is this moral typecasting piece. So men not getting compassion is one more reason they don't go into therapy. They don't expect people to want to listen. I'll never forget when I was seeing men. One guy said to me, he said, "Do you really want to hear this?" He was incredulous. And I said, "Yeah, man. Yeah, go right ahead." But I mean, that's the stance of men a lot of times, because they think in terms of hierarchy, and they think in terms of empathy gap, where people aren't going to be so compassionate towards them when they need help. I mean, like, geez, I worked with death and dying, with grieving people for 25, 30 years, and over again, I'd see the same thing. When a man and a woman had a child die, everyone would come and put their arms around the women. "Oh, how are you? What can I do for you? La, 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 la," right? And they'd go to the man and they'd say, "How's your wife doing?"
Right.
It's like he wouldn't get the same kind of treatment. So all of these four things together make it very clear why men are probably not going to want to go to therapy,
Right. I want to come back to the hierarchy that we were talking about earlier. I think that could be a whole topic onto its own for another discussion.
Oh, boy.
But one of the purposes, it seems to me, of hierarchies is accountability and responsibility. Is that the people towards the top, the managers, the decision makers, those people with power and authority, with authority comes responsibility.
Yes.
If you have it without responsibility, then you're just a tyrant. But if you have responsibility without authority, then you're a slave, right? You're just somebody who's used as a tool by somebody else.
Yes.
And part of the problem that I see in the world today, one thing is that there seems to be a movement towards flat organizations, like everyone's equal, there's nobody above and below. And while in some situations that may have value, I think it's dangerous in that it takes away responsibility when there are mistakes or when there are problems. Where do you hold? Who's got the buck? Basically, like where does it end? And who has to clean up the mess? And part of the problem I see between men and women, as you said with the moral typecasting, is that men in general are seen as responsible.
Yes.
And when society's broken, or a company's broken, or a family's broken, we look first to the man and say, what did he do wrong? What does he need to do better?
Yeah.
But we don't hold women often to the same standards, where we say, there's no female equivalent of man up, that kind of a phrase, right? We don't say woman up.
Yes.
Or we don't say it's a man's job to do X, it's a woman's job to do what? There's no answer to that question.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem of where we are at right now with this friction between men and women that you see all throughout social media, you see it in the culture, is that we're not holding the two genders to the same standards.
Indeed not. And it's 40 years of lies. 40 years of lies from radical feminists about how men are this way and men are that way, and the whole thing about domestic violence and lying about men not being victims of domestic violence. I mean, this quote by Ellen Pence was just really opened my eyes. Ellen Pence was one of the writers of the Duluth model. And she said, well, in the early days, we just kind of turned a blind eye to women's violence and to their abuse of their children and to their addictions. And we only focused on the men. She literally said that. And that is what they've done and they're still doing it now with the VAWA in America. And it's like the whole thing is women are the victims and men are the perpetrators. And this is crazy. It's absolutely insane. And it goes on not just in domestic violence stuff, but all over the place, like you're saying. I mean, it's every place. And what is it? It's what would you call it? Exalting the feminine and pushing down the masculine, because the masculine is the hierarchy. The problem is we've gone all feminine. We've got to have both. You've got to have both masculine and feminine. You've got to have that sense of sensitivity that women have that men may lack in some ways, but you got to have that sense of courage that men have in spades. It's like, and if we shame one, we're both not doing well. Like Warren Farrell says, if you're in a family boat and only one person rows on one side, you're just going to go in circles. And that's what we're doing now. We're going in circles.
Right, exactly.
Because we are dishonoring our men. We need to let men be men. It's a dangerous place to do that now, because as soon as you look like you're going to be a guy, people shame you, or they cancel you, or they put you in jail.
Exactly.
Crazy place, man. Crazy place.
The culture is wild right now.
Ugh.
But the question of what does it mean to be a good man in today's society is a tricky one to answer, because you have traditional conservatives on one side saying the old masculinity, we got to go back to that. We need to, the old virtues, the classic virtues of stoicism and courage and intelligence and hard work and patience and these kinds of things.
Right.
But what's interesting is like conservatives, I think, are failing to stem the damage from radical feminism and from certain movements that are flaming, increasing the flames in the gender war. They have failed to recognize the damage of some extreme versions of feminism, and they don't really have an answer for it. And then progressives are usually the ones that are, on the gender lens, they're kind of moving us into that bad direction. So there's very few, other than yourself and the people on your website, Janice Fiamengo, Stephen Baskerville, Warren Farrell, these classic names that the men's rights activists are familiar with. You are doing this work to bring balance back. But I don't see in politics, I don't see a lot of good movements for gender balance, other than on a superficial level, which is with the numbers. But the balance between masculinity and femininity, I don't see a lot of broad movements for that.
Sadly, I agree 100%. What a mess we're in.
So how could we get out of that mess? What do you think?
One person at a time, baby. Do it yourself. Stand up and be who you are. Don't let anybody tell you, that you're supposed to be a certain way, that you're supposed to be this, you're supposed to be that. Screw that. Be what you are. If you're a cranky old guy, be a cranky old guy. That's basically who you are. And smile at it. Say, here I am being a cranky old fart. But we got to do it one person at a time. I mean, there's other things we can do politically, but I think that it all starts with ourselves.
Yeah.
It all starts with who we are and what we're willing to do, and how much truth we're willing to get out there and tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. You have to change people on a personal level. I don't think that politics is going to shift the culture. I think,
It's the other way
some
around.
people say politics is downstream of culture.
Right. Yeah,
What
Breitbart said that, I think.
what they're thinking and feeling and living in their personal lives that's the leading edge. That's like the beginning. And then politics just reflects that after a time period, maybe years later. The laws reflect what people are already feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that people can do is to meditate. Make sure you spend some time every day getting very quiet. And we could go into why that's the case, but man, that is so critical, because it really helps in so many different ways. It helps in self-reflection and psychological ways. It helps us get in touch with what we really want to do. It helps in so many different ways. And it helps us become who we are, not who we think we should be.
Mm-hmm.
Get quiet. Enjoy it. Go to a stream, sit there and have no thoughts. Just don't think. Just watch the stream. Be there with the stream. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite ways of de-stressing, is to just get out into nature, go for a hike, go for a walk in the woods.
Yes.
Get out of the city for a while.
Yes. The Japanese call it forest bathing.
Yeah.
I love that term, forest bathing.
Exactly.
That's good.
So I want to chat a little bit about your website and your YouTube channel, because to me these seem to be the best places where we can learn about your work and your contributions, and also the other people in your circles. We've mentioned a couple of the names on your website, and you have a great book. By the way, the website, we'll put the link down in the video description here, but it's basically menaregood.com.
Menaregood.com.
Easy to find. And on there you have a fantastic list of books on men's issues.
Yes.
And you also have a playlist of the top 20 videos from your YouTube channel.
Yes. I think, do I have Janice's up there too? I forget whether I do or not, but there's a bunch of video playlists that kind of pick out different videos and looking at this and that. And yeah, it's a good place to go and just kind of ponder for a while.
Yes. And I love how you start all of your YouTube videos with "men are good, and so are you."
Yes.
Like, it's a very simple message. It's really basic, but even that is seldom heard nowadays.
Yes.
Just the fact of saying men are good, as simple as it may seem, it'll start to change a few minds.
Yeah, and it shocks people sometimes. What? Men are good? What?
Yeah.
And they are. The vast majority of men are good. Just like the vast majority of women are good. And
of course, like, with these broad statements, it doesn't mean that all men's actions are all good all the time, like, not categorically. But we should start with that as our starting point when we're talking to a man. Assume that he's good, and then see what happens, right?
Yes.
Rather than assuming he's evil, he's toxic, all of these stupid words, right?
And the reason I came up with the whole men are good thing was that I learned from the black folks in the civil rights days. One of the first things they did was they had little buttons they'd give out that says, "Black is beautiful." And that started to change people's perceptions of themselves, because black people had been beaten up by the media, beaten up by academia, beaten up by the research, and beaten up by everybody. And their sense of self just was smushed down. And so this whole thing, black is beautiful, said, yeah, maybe I am. It gave them a glimmer of hope. The same thing needs to happen today with men, because men are beaten down by the media, they're beaten down by academia, and by the research in so many different ways. So men are good, as are you.
They are. Thank you very much. I agree fully. And that's I want my organization to get that message out too, that
All right, good.
men and boys and families are good. They may have problems sometimes, but problems can be solved. Answers can be found, and we should start with that. Men are good.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. So I will encourage people to go check out your YouTube channel because you have, I don't know how many, but hundreds of videos, I think.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not as viral as some other channels on YouTube, but I think that's a whole other discussion behind the scenes of what's happening with the algorithms. You know,
Yes, they're
any
tamping it
pro
down.
male content creator, like there's very few
Right.
that get a large following. The one example I could think of, maybe Jordan Peterson. He's got about 5 million subscribers on his channel.
Yes.
But he's not a men's advocate explicitly. He's a psychologist, and he
Right.
talks about a range of issues.
Yes.
But he does have, I think, a positive outlook towards men and boys in general, as opposed to the broader culture.
Yes. Yes. And the young men love him.
They love him. He's the father they wish they had.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. In fact,
Yeah.
I've got a series of videos. It may be on the website. The things I wish my father had told me. You know,
Yeah.
So about the things I wish my dad had said.
Yeah, those are good videos.
Yeah.
I saw some of your more recent ones as well with Alan Siddiqui, who wrote the.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I spelled it wrong.
Yeah.
But,
He's incredible.
yeah, he had he wrote his thesis on. Why don't you tell me what his thesis was on? I think you know him better than
The
I do.
thesis is on the prejudice that men face. And it's about 400 pages long, but man, it reads like a book. It reads like a novel. What he talks about is that the prejudice that men face today is what he terms acceptable prejudice, so that the culture accepts that this prejudice exists. And he said this is something that happens with almost all splinter groups. It happened with the civil rights groups, you know, where they were basically pushed away. And the blacks faced all kinds of prejudice, you know, but slowly that dissipated over time. You know, as soon as people started looking at it, he says the researchers are the last people to figure it out. The culture starts to know things well before the researchers even get there. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, there is a lag, I think. If you look at really the cutting edge of where culture is, I would say it's on places like social media.
Sometimes.
Like not only there, but if you look at entertainment, social media as well as television, film, music, the artists, the creative fields, I think are really the ones who are the most sensitive to the new energies coming into the world, and they do all of their work, and people absorb it, they digest it. And things like politics and law and academic research, they only discover it after the fact.
Yep, that is true.
Yeah.
That is true. But Aman is fantastic. I've done 3 videos with him now, and each one of them is just fantastic. The guy knows more about prejudice than anybody I've ever met, probably anybody I'll ever know. And he will tell you how it starts, what makes it go, what makes it different. It's just, and then he, the whole focus of the dissertation is understanding prejudice against men in order to build a safe container as a therapist with men. And he says psychologists cannot work with men until they understand the prejudice that they face. And he's so right, man. He's so right on the money. So therapists out there, go read Aman's dissertation or watch those 3 videos. You'll get a general sense of what he's talking about. Fascinating stuff.
No, it's very fascinating. The other one that I liked was William Collins' The Empathy Gap. I would like to get him on the podcast as well. I think you're familiar with his work. That book that he wrote, which the digital version is really great because there's all the links where you can find the original data.
Yes.
And it's a UK focus, but I think the numbers would be very similar in North America.
Very similar.
Like you mentioned earlier in this conversation, the empathy gap, that pretty much lays the whole case for it in his work. He shows in so many different fields how when men face, either discrimination or a disparity in any quantifiable way, the world basically just doesn't care.
Right.
And what we need to do is to start caring more. And, it affects everybody. It doesn't just affect men when men are suffering. It affects their children, their spouses, their friends, the community, everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his new book, The Destructivists, is well worth having a look at. It's a fantastic book on, he basically takes the woke culture, what he calls the woke industrial complex, and breaks it down and looks at, okay, how does it work? What are its parts? And how can we change it? It's fascinating stuff. Really good stuff.
So I think we can start to bring it to a close, this discussion, but I did have a thought. Maybe you can tell me your feedback on this. I've thought that what we need is more pro-male creative content, like books, films, television,
Yes.
anything that pop culture that people consume. There doesn't seem to be enough of that right now, and that could be part of the reason why the negative views towards men are so acceptable, is that we're not seeing the examples that previous generations had, like a Superman, Batman, Spider-Man. Like, I know it sounds a little bit childish, but these boys and young men need role models to look up to. They need,
question.
as you said, manhood doesn't come automatically. It has to be earned.
Yes.
And it's something you learn and you grow into. And if they don't have examples either with their own father or with other men, fictional or non-fictional, then how are they going to know what that looks like to be a man?
Yes. Yeah, it reminds me of the Brilliant Bob series that the fellow did. He wrote a series of books for young boys about masculinity. And they're great little books, stories about boys working together as a team and doing this and doing that. They're all about courage, persistence, things like that. Stoicism. He does all kinds of things. Good stuff. There's a video, I think Paul and Janice and I did that one together.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and they're on your website as well. Those books are linked.
Yes, yeah, they're certainly in that list of books that are the top men's books, yes.
Right.
Indeed.
Right. Well, do you have any final words that you want to share, Tom, with our audience?
No, thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. It's been a pleasure learning a lot of things, as always, and I hope we get a chance to chat again in the future.
Good deal. We'll see you then. Men are good.
They are. Thank you.
As are you.